Okay. Well, this morning I'm going to deal with one of the greatest myths of modern U.S. history. And that is, dropping the atomic bombs on Japan was necessary to induce the Japanese surrender of 1945. The rationale is that it saved lives, a non sequitur referring to the official justification of the only alternative to a full-scale frontal main force invasion was to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, an alternative to an Asian version of D-Day. This reminds me of what a former employer used to say, look, I hear what you're saying, but because like most popular myths, it's propaganda hardened into patriotic dogma which vested interests very violently defend, as in the case of the Smithsonian Institution back in the 90s when it had a display that dared to challenge this mythology. Now I know I'm already getting, as though you're just rehashing leftist revisionist crapola. However, I do understand U.S. veterans were told that if it weren't for the bomb, President Truman would have sent them into this invasion force with an estimated loss of at least 250,000 American troops, about as many Japanese casualties, and an incalculable number of Japanese civilian casualties. So to these men it's personal, clear-cut, black and white, a matter of non-choice. And besides, of course, real American military men knew that it was necessary from the get-go. Well, one can't blame them for preferring the loss of other people's lives to their own, human nature being what it is. But as a point of military necessity, this belief is just wrong. It was not necessary to use atomic weaponry to induce a Japanese surrender. And American military leaders of the time knew this perfectly well. Admiral William D. Leahy said, and I quote, "It is my opinion that the use of this barbarous weapon was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender. My own feeling was that in being the first to use it, we had adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. I was not taught to make war in that fashion, and wars cannot be won by destroying women and children." Allied Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower said it was his belief that Japan was already defeated and that dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary as a measure to save American lives. Admiral Chester Nimitz put it more succinctly to author James Michener in 1944. "They're licked and they can't do anything about it. We have the unspeakable bastards licked." How could they say that, even a year before the dropping of the bomb and the surrender? Because the U.S. naval blockade was effective in strangling Japan's ability to continue fighting. Japanese economy has always been 90% or more dependent on imports, hence its aggressive imperialism in the first place. The Japanese military had already been driven off the Asian mainland, except for the isolated army in Manchuria, and from the outlying Pacific Islands. The firebombing of Tokyo and other vital targets had devastated the country's industrial capacity and its civilian population. No false rhetoric there, I assure you, about saving lives. The real necessity for using atomic weapons was, of course, political. To shock Stalin at the Potsdam Conference, to keep Soviet forces out of Japan, and avoid the joint occupation problems that were already causing headaches for the West and Germany. Japan had to surrender before the USSR could mobilize its forces for an invasion, and most importantly, they had to surrender to the US. But all this could have been avoided by letting the blockade take its course. It was estimated that a further 6 months of economic isolation would have produced the desired tensions, divisions, and dangers of civil war that would have induced a Japanese surrender. To coincide with, of course, dropping the rhetoric of unconditional surrender with guarantees for the emperor. And in fact, that's exactly what brought the Japanese delegation aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd. Again, as long as it was a surrender to the United States. But waiting 6 more months was not expedient. Truman wanted all his work cards on the table simultaneously. Thus, his false choice was between a full frontal invasion with the risk of joint Soviet occupation or the use of atomic weapons. As we know, the USSR declared war on August 9th, and many analysts are convinced that the threat of Soviet occupation and a divided Japan was as great an inducement for surrender as the follow-up bombing of Nagasaki on the same day. Now, there is, in fact, a certain positive afterglow in this action. Some unintended fallout that, only in hindsight, mind you, was actually beneficial. The only saving graces to using the bomb in 1945. First, it's incontestable that it was far better for the United States to have used it than Nazi Germany, which was also in the process of developing atomic weapons. There's no doubt that a bug-crazy and desperate Hitler would have employed mass atomic terror and blackmail to pull the head of victory out of the ass of defeat. Second, that these weapons were used at an early stage of nuclear development, when their devastation was relatively contained, relatively minimal, and their potential for evil as unnecessary for further display as they were for saving lives. Third, that there was then no nuclear proliferation, and thus no worry over retaliation in kind. The Soviet atomic bomb soon put a period to that. As an aside, it was the belief of the Fuchs-Rosenberg spy ring that proliferation did in fact guarantee peace, an opinion ironically echoed by nuclear advocates to this day. I can knock at the phone. Who was this while I'm trying to do a YouTube video? Hello? Curtis LeMay? Post of Veterans of Foreign Wars? Informing me that there is a Strategic Air Command life-saving mission in my area? Hold on, I can't hear you. There's a plane overhead. Making as much fucking racket as a B-52. Hold on.